Thank you very much. Okay, so the first thing I would like to say is that I'm very happy that you are all here. Welcome to the 8th lecture and debate within our consumption seminar series. I am Monica Truninger, by the way, and before introducing today our guest speaker, I'm going to say a few words about the purpose of these seminars, the rationale that is behind this seminar series. They have been organized by 3 people, me and Emilia Margarida, hello, and Marta Rosales. Unfortunately, she could not be here. They are 2 anthropologists and a sociologist. And the aim of this seminar series is to bring closer to the different publics, so not only academic but also non-academic, issues related to consumption through a set of lectures followed by debates and given by prominent figures in the field of consumption studies. And as you know, consumption studies is a multidisciplinary field composed of plural perspectives, and whenever we invite someone to come here, there will be a different angle put forward that we want to invite to think and to engage with. So the purpose is really to think widely about consumption. And another feature of these seminars that we always try to achieve, basically, is that they are informal and it's always outside an academic context, like for instance the bookshop, which is a perfect place for that. So it is very important for us to have a more informal platform where to discuss consumption issues, a topic that is becoming ever more relevant in the context of present and future challenges. And the first thing that also, or one of the things I would like to say now that I talk about the bookshop, is that we really thank the kind support of the Livraria Sá da Costa for letting us host this seminar in this very nice space, and also thank the support of our home institutions, ICS, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and also Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia, which is our national funding organization. So now it's time just to give you a few words about our speaker today. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you Peter Jackson, who is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sheffield. And he has just completed a study on consumer anxieties about food. He's going to talk about that, I think, tomorrow at ICS. So if some of you would be interested, you can most welcome to that seminar. It's free. It is at 3 o'clock, by the way, and at Instituto de Ciências Sociais da Universidade de Lisbon. So the consumer anxieties, he has just completed this study. It was funded by the European Research Council, and he previously directed an interdisciplinary research program for the Liverpool Trust called Changing Families, Changing Food. And he helped create the Food Stories website hosted by the British Library. You can Google it. So if you put Food Stories British Library, you'll reach the place, and it's just amazing. I mean, I love that place, so I really invite you to go and to search. There is lots. It's a very interesting use of oral history sources. And so there are food stories. It's about Britain, obviously, so it is the British context. Recent publications include Changing Families, Changing Food by Palgrave, a book that came out in 2009. And in our work on school meals, it has been quite important, so we know it quite well. And Food Words, Essays in Culinary Culture, which is a book that has just come out last week, I believe. And related to his academic work, Peter currently chairs UK Food Standards Agency Social Science Research Committee. We would very much like to thank Peter to be here today with us. And let's learn more about the connections between words and food. Talk very appropriate for a space like this, for a bookshop. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica.
I'm going there.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Monica and colleagues, for inviting me here today, and thank you to the bookstore for hosting this event. I must say, I thought, who would turn out on a Thursday evening to hear some guy from England talking about his latest book, and I'm overwhelmed that you're here. I'm really pleased to see you all. As Monica said, this is intended to be an informal presentation leading to a discussion, so I shall gauge the success of the talk by how much discussion it generates, which is a dangerous thing to say. Okay, So thank you for this opportunity to talk about the connections between food and words. It is the topic of a book which we've just published in England, and my publishers have insisted that I bring along these leaflets to advertise it. So this is a commercial, an advert. I want not just to talk about the book, but I want to talk about the idea behind the book, which is to explore the links between food and words. The book is a series of essays on some of the key words that define contemporary attitudes to food. And some of these words are academic words within food studies, ranging from sciences through to arts and humanities. But they're also words which circulate in popular culture, in ordinary everyday life, in discussions around food, all those TV programs you see about food, for example. And also the way in which these words then are used in public policy, in government, and in the regulation of food. So the idea of the book is to try and look at the way words about food circulate within society and how those words take on different meanings in different contexts. So not that these words are stable and can be defined once and for all, but looking at the way words about food take on different meanings, have different salience in different kind of contexts. So as Monica said, I'm a geographer by background, and one of the things I want to try to illustrate in this talk is the sort of power of thinking geographically, making connections between places, making links between scales from the global right down to the local. But I want to begin with the words of an anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who argued famously that food is good to think with, bon à penser, as well as good to eat, bon à manger. And obviously it's not always good to think with and not always good to eat either. But the idea is that we can think through food as well as consume it in a bodily way. Think for a moment then about restaurant menus and the way restaurant menus describe food. Certainly in Britain at the moment, the kind of cultures described as foodie cultures have got blown out of hand, to the point where menus will often describe in several lines the food you're about to eat, and where the act of consumption, arguably, is as much about consuming the words and the description of the food as it is about the food itself. So I'd argue that food menus demonstrate that food is both about talk as well as about taste. It's verbal and it's visceral. It's about the visceral qualities of food. It's both material, the stuff of food, and symbolic. And food has this really nice double quality, which I think we try to illustrate in this talk about food and words. If you look at sociologists who've written about food, like Alan Ward, for example, in the UK, he suggests that food is often thought about in terms of dualisms. So he talks about our need for novelty and tradition. We like new food, but we also like to think about food, where it comes from, food heritage, food traditions. Alan Ward says we think about food in terms of health, what's good for us, healthy eating, diet, nutrition, but also food as an indulgence, something which is about the pleasures of food, its taste, the pleasures of eating together and so on. He says that food is about economy, getting value for money, but it's also about extravagance. We use food to entertain, food for hospitality and so on. And he says that food is about convenience and care. So think about feeding the family and the gendered nature of feeding the family, when we're both providing food which is convenient and fits in with our lives, but also food as an expression of love, of sacrifice, of maternal care. And I think we could add to that long list of dualisms. The project I've just finished that Monica talked about was thinking about the anxieties of food and the pleasures of food. I've already mentioned the geographical idea that food can be thought of locally and globally. So some foods produced very locally, some foods imported across huge distances along very long, complex food chains. We can think about food in terms of safety and risk. We can think about food in terms of innovation and tradition. So the book explores those tensions and contradictions and inconsistencies in the way in which we talk about food. Food Words was inspired by the work of Raymond Williams, who some of you may know. Raymond Williams wrote a book called Key Words, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society in 1976. The book itself has an interesting little history because it was originally intended as a short appendix to the book he wrote called Culture and Society. Culture and Society was his account of industrialisation, urbanisation, big historical changes. And in the course of writing that, he realised that particular words, culture, nature, democracy, art and so on, were good ways of mapping these changes in society. And he started to write them down. And then the appendix kind of got out of hand and became a whole book project in itself. And Keywords, I think, is a fantastic book in itself. It's a great book to work with students. And it's a book that we decided we'd try and copy, specifically in relation to food. Why I like the book is because it's not a dictionary. It doesn't provide a definition of a word that says this is what it means. Not an exact translation of a word. It says that that's not a smart way to think about words. We need to think about words in terms of what Williams called their fields of meaning. The way in which a word has a set of associations. It has a cultural context. It's deployed by people in different ways. It often serves particular political and material interests. So Williams was about tracing this dynamic field of meaning of his keywords, tracking their changing use over time and place, tracking their different reception in different social contexts. Williams argued that our social vocabulary is active and contested. So just think, for example, of the way in which the idea of food choice is deployed by governments at the present time, particularly neoliberal governments. Thinking about choice, choice is a word, why would you not approve of choice? Choice is a very positive word, and yet the way food choice is discussed tends to individualise food choice, where we as individual consumers choose what we eat, and then we're held responsible for those decisions. So if we feed our children food which is high in fat or salt or sugar, we're responsible for the obesity epidemic that follows. So that individualisation, that forgetting about the constraints within which people work, forgetting about the infrastructure that provides food, thinking about the power of supermarket chains, for example, in determining the food that gets on our table. All of that, I think, is condensed into this apparently innocent word choice, which in fact could be argued to be a very specific way of thinking about food. Or think about the concept of food security, and the way that way of thinking about food is quite different from thinking about food sovereignty. Think about the way food security raises issues about other kinds of security and insecurity. And so on. They're just simple little examples which I think suggest that words we use in a quite everyday, unexamined way, once you start to unpack them, is a very good way into thinking about this more active social vocabulary that Williams described, and which we've now stolen as a good idea to approach food. So we're interested then in how meanings circulate, how they're appropriated and used, or how words travel. Food Words, the book we've just finished, includes just over 60 words, but we would never say that it was comprehensive. It's a provocation. It's a set of words that we think are interesting, and they're interesting from our point of view at this point in time. And I guarantee if we kind of asked each of you what your top keywords were around food, they would be different from mine. So part of the book again is faithful to Williams' inspiration. It's not trying to be definitive, it's trying to say that our words, the words we've chosen in the book, reflect particular ways of seeing the world. Historically, geographically, we're socially positioned in certain ways. So think, for example, of a word like consumer. This is a seminar series about consumption. Consumer, again, is not some innocent word. It's not something that means the same as customer or public or housewife. Consumer is a very particular way of thinking about our relationship to food and other material goods and services. We need to think about when the public came to be described as consumers, at what point in history, in which kinds of societies, and how the idea that we are consumers, rather than citizens, for example, might reflect on particular ways of thinking about citizenship and democracy and so on. So the book, I'm kind of defending myself from my critics before you've even heard what the book's about. And it's very clear that food words would look different 100 years ago. They look different when approached from the global south. So there is an inherent danger of ethnocentrism in presenting a book of food words, which we're very conscious of in the way we approach the book. So again, if you thought of a word like exotic in relation to food, or ethnic in relation to food, again, those words are not innocent. They're always exotic from a particular point of view, or foods are described as ethnic, always from a point of view of a culinary culture defined as mainstream or apparently ethnically unmarked. So those are examples of some of the words in the book and how we've approached them. What I want to do is just briefly say something about the way in which I think the current social and political context has shaped our approach to food words. And then if we have time, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples of the words and how we've unpacked them. And I'm particularly interested to see how these words travel to a context outside of my Anglo-centric world where we've defined the words. So we'll see the extent to which the words translate and to the extent to which the translation itself reveals something about those words. So very briefly then, the kind of current context around food, and I imagine this will be quite familiar to many of you in the audience. The UN Secretary General describes us as living through the worst food crisis in a generation. And he was referring specifically to the food price rises in 2007-2008, which forced tens of thousands of people into food poverty and malnutrition, whilst at the same time another substantial fraction of the world's population was experiencing overconsumption and a so-called obesity epidemic. So these kind of parallel trends towards over and under consumption happening at the same time in different parts of the world, and I'd argue being connected to each other, not just 2 separate trends, is very much part of the current political context that shapes our way of thinking about food and the words we use to describe it. I've already mentioned the kind of global concern about food security, which again I think is a highly loaded way of thinking about food provision, providing sufficient, safe, affordable food to allow people to live an active and healthy life. And I think it's really interesting the way food security as an issue began as a concern in the global south and has now been appropriated by governments in the global north as kind of our problem too. The current context of food is, I think, shaped by a history of intensification of agricultural production. It's been shaped by lengthening food supply chains, by the concentration of power in the hands of a smaller number of supermarkets. It's been shaped by recent food scares, specifically in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, things like BSE, or so-called mad cow disease, through to the current debates around horse meat and adulteration of food, which have led to a substantial undermining of consumer confidence and trust in food. In 2010, there was a big survey of European consumers by the group called Eurobarometer. It showed that half of European consumers were concerned that food may damage their health, and this had gone up since 2005. It showed that 2/3 of European consumers were worried about the quality and freshness of food, and over half felt that food today is less safe than it was 10 years ago. An editorial in the current issue of the journal Food, Culture and Society begins with the phrase, "We live in a scary world when it comes to food." And that, I think, is really interesting if you think of it historically, because in many ways our food supply is safer, cheaper than in many points in human history. And I think the book I've been involved in has been very much shaped by the project I've just completed about consumer anxieties about food. So we are anxious, perhaps. Are we more anxious than we need to be? Are we anxious to the point where we've forgotten the pleasures of food? and what is the kind of context that lies behind that. Okay, what I want to do for the rest of this short presentation is to take 3, or if I have time, 4 of the keywords in the book and give you a little bit of background about those words and why we think they are key words, and give you a taste, no pun intended, for the way in which approaching food through words might give us a kind of lens on the political, cultural, economic, social significance of food. So these aren't, they might be alphabetical, they're not alphabetical, but I start with a word beginning with A. I start with the word authentic. Authentico? Authentic is a word that is so regularly used around food that it's almost entirely lost its meaning, I would argue. In Britain, almost every Indian restaurant advertises itself as an authentic restaurant. Its food is authentic. Even dishes like chicken tikka masala that are completely unknown in India, actually they're not anymore, they're now being introduced in India in restaurants used by cosmopolitan tourists. But even food which is demonstrably not from the place it allegedly comes from is being described as authentic. Everyone knows that most Indian restaurants in the UK are run by Bangladeshis rather than by Indians, and that their menus have been adjusted to suit British culinary tastes. That doesn't mean it's bad. It means that the description of authentic is a kind of marketing exercise rather than anything about the specific nature of the food. Even the most global brands, like Coca-Cola, insist that they are the real thing. What does that mean? The notion of reality, the notion of authenticity implied. So if we take that as read, then that authenticity is a contestable term. It's become so sedimented in our everyday lives that we often don't think very much about it. How do we problematise it? How do we get a handle on it? Well, one thing is to look at the way in which notions like authenticity are deployed in other cultural contexts. If you think about music and a performance of music described as authentic, sometimes it refers to the use of period instruments. So an authentic performance of early music is not played on instruments from the 21st century. People create or recreate instruments that are authentic to the period in which the music was composed. So that would be one notion of authenticity. Another way, though, would be to say you can use contemporary, present-day instruments as long as you remain faithful to the spirit of the original composition. So is authenticity in music about real instruments and a real representation of music composed a long time ago, or can it be something which is contemporary but still faithful in some intentional way? Think about tourism and the way authenticity is used in tourism studies. Big debates in tourism about when you go abroad and see a presentation of a traditional dance or traditional food or whatever. And that's been described by some critics as staged authenticity, which is almost a contradiction in terms. We're staging an authentic presentation for your benefit, with the kind of notion that those involved in the presentation and those consuming it kind of conspire to suspend their disbelief in order to enjoy the presentation as part of their tourist experience. In food, authenticity could mean a whole series of things. It can mean simple food, food produced in an artisanal way. It can mean food where there is a personal connection between the food producer and the food they produce. It can invoke notions of history in tradition. It can invoke notions that it is somehow closer to nature than industrialised or commercialised food. It can invoke notions of an ethical kind to do with sincerity and honesty and trust. And what we suggest in the book is that rather than try to set ourselves up as arbiters of what is authentic and what is fake, what is real and what is unreal, a better sociological way of approaching it is to think about the process of authentication. Who is making the claims that something is authentic? On what basis are they doing it? And for what purpose? So you shift the debate from this is real and this is fake, this is authentic and this is not. So who is making these claims? Why are they making the claims? Whose interests are represented? The second word I want to share with you is the notion of provenance. This is much harder, I think, in Portuguese. Proveniencia? Proveniencia. Okay. So provenance. Provenance is widely used in British culinary culture to think about literally where food comes from, its place of origin. And again, if we think laterally, where else is the word used? Provenance is often used in relation to antiques and artworks. So it's about whether an artwork is really by the painter whose name appears in the corner, whether the antique is genuine, whether you can document its legal history of ownership. So provenance in relation to food borrows some of that way it's used in relation to artworks and antiques, and has some of these kind of legal connotations involved. For food, provenance can be about specific ingredients, but it can also be about whole dishes, and indeed whole styles of cooking, or indeed national cuisine. And clearly then provenance starts to link back to the discussion we've just had about authenticity. A common way of thinking about provenance is in terms of the French word terroir, often used in relation to food, but also in relation to wine. And the idea of terroir is that food takes on specific characteristics from its place of origin, and that process can involve both the physical conditions of a place. So wine has a particular taste because of the geology of the area it's grown in, or its climate, or its soils. So that physical notion of provenance and terroir. But also, terroir then leaks into another notion of provenance, which is to do with the people who produce it. So it might be soil, geology, vegetation, climate, but it can also be a notion that somehow the people in a particular place have a history that has given them a series of embodied skills acquired over generations, so only people in place X can make food of that particular kind or that particular quality. And then back to the artwork and antique stuff, that local and regional production is now increasingly underpinned by legislation about geographical indicators of where things come from. And all kinds of paradoxes then open up when you start to think about how these legal definitions of provenance get invoked. So the example of Stilton cheese in the UK is governed by EU legislation. It says that Stilton cheese can only come from one of 3 English counties. The village of Stilton, which gives Stilton cheese its name, is not in those 3 counties, so Stilton cheese can't be made in the village of Stilton. It's sort of mad, but it's not mad at all when you think about the way in which these kind of designations come about and whose interests they serve. And there is no suggestion that Stilton cheese has its character from geology, climate, soil and so on. The milk that's used to produce Stilton cheese, some of it comes from those 3 counties, but when milk is in short supply, it's cooled and brought in from elsewhere. So all kinds of interesting things are going on when particular products strive to get these kind of legalistic definitions of provenance. It raises, I think, much bigger questions about the links between food and place. Age-old debates, the Italianness of pizza. Is pizza anything to do with Italy? Was pizza invented in Chicago? The Indianness of curry, I've already referred to, and so on. So quite a lot of that is about imagined provenance and not connected in any direct way to specific geographical places. And I think it shows that most culinary boundaries, most issues to do with food provenance, suggests that these boundaries are porous, they're leaky. Culinary history is characterised by borrowing and adaptation, rather than a kind of foolhardy quest to find the real place that a particular dish or a particular ingredient comes from. I would argue that that relentless tracing of origins, which some food historians are very keen to do, is a sort of pursuit that's never going to end. And the sort of search for a purity around culinary culture is a cul-de-sac, I think. We okay?
Yeah.
My next word then is the word fresh. Fresco. Yeah?
Yeah.
Fresh is a really popular word in food marketing. It's often linked to notions that food is natural as opposed to artificial or processed. On my airline this morning, the little highly processed chicken sandwich I was given to eat used the word fresh and the word natural in its little description. It also told me it was a really healthy option, low in fat, and so on. You know, but one of the most processed, refrigerated, preserved kind of foods you could imagine. So fresh is, again, a bit like the other words I've been describing, a word which has almost lost its meaning by the way in which its meaning has evolved and been adapted and used in commercial and marketing terms. One of the ironies of the word fresh is that in modern agri-food systems, freshness, as presented to us on the plate or in the supermarket, often depends on a series of technological innovations, like refrigeration, like air freight, for example, that are, of course, anything but natural in its normal sense. The geographer Suzanne Friedberg wrote a book recently called Fresh, A Perishable History, that explores these kind of ironies. She argues that with our current agri-food system, it's easier to eat local, fresh produce in Berkeley, California, than in Burkina Faso, two places where she's worked. So you might think that an authentic food tradition, a local food tradition, ought to be easier in a lower technological society like Burkina Faso. But she argues that through the way it's produced, through the way the market evolves, food can be sold as local and fresh more readily in an affluent American suburb like Berkeley than in Burkina Faso. There are also interesting links between the notion of freshness and notions of food waste. You'll be aware of all the recent publicity about food waste and statistics that we waste around a third of the food that we produce. The imperative to reduce food waste often runs up against culturally approved notions of freshness. So we might want not to waste food in some abstract sense, but if we also want to eat food that's perceived as fresh, there is an automatic tension between them. Tristan Stewart, who wrote a book on food waste, used the example of a firm called Yo Sushi in London. Yo Sushi felt that it had to produce food that was fresh and seemed to be fresh to its customers. So even 10 minutes before the shops closed in the evening, the shelves had to be full. Empty shelves looked bad. Empty shelves didn't appeal to consumers. So more sushi was made and put on shelves in the clear knowledge that it would be wasted in order to produce the notion of freshness and abundance and plenty that their consumers needed. And Stewart has endless examples of that tension between freshness and waste. There are also, of course, interesting discussions about freshness and social class, where certainly throughout history, fresh food has been mostly available as a luxury food, as a luxury commodity. If we think about fresh and its opposites, or fresh and what its other is, the example of milk is a really interesting one. Fresh milk to most of us these days is pasteurised milk. It's processed milk, still described as fresh, and so-called raw milk is often considered riskier in food safety terms than processed or pasteurised milk. And the whole history of industrialisation and the need to produce fresh food for urban consumers increasingly distanced from rural places of production lies behind that. And there are other examples where fresh is less clearly defined and less obviously a positive thing. No one ever, to my knowledge, describes food as stale. Stale is never a good thing. But for cheese and for wine, for example, mature or aged is often better than younger and fresher. So there's some interesting paradoxes that, again, I think show the limits to a simple-minded way of approaching freshness as natural. Last word? Still got time? Yeah. The last word is taste. Gosto? In English, and we think in Portuguese, although we can discuss this later, the word taste has a double meaning. In English, at least, it refers to physical, sensory, embodied taste, the ability to distinguish sweetness and sour, salty and bitter. So physical taste. But at the same time, it also refers to the social distinctions around taste. So you might have good taste. You might exercise good taste and judgment. Going to the opera and the ballet, enjoying fine food and wine would be exercising culturally approved good taste. So the links between physical taste as sensation and what Pierre Bourdieu would write about in Distinction, about the social judgment of taste, is a really interesting conjunction. The historian Stephen Manell wrote a book which compared British and French culinary history. And I can say this as British, in all comparisons between British and French culinary culture, it's France that wins. British food is often, probably quite rightly, derided. But the comparisons in Manell's work are about how it is that French culinary culture got to be regarded as the height of good taste, and the kind of processes involved in terms of food critics, restaurant writers, Michelin guides and so on, that led to one culinary culture being privileged above another. And Manell uses a really interesting comparison between the good taste of the gourmet, someone who enjoys fine food, and the excessive, uneducated appetite of the glutton. So I don't know how those words were translated to Portuguese, but there are different ways of appreciating food, its quantity and its quality. Gourmet, good; glutton, bad, crudely. And they also point to class variations in taste. In the UK, you could do this in terms of a preference for beer versus lager. You could certainly do it in terms of distinctions or taste preferences for wine and spirits like whiskey. You could do it for particular brands. You could produce a very detailed class hierarchy based on tastes for foods. You could do it in terms of preferences for white sliced bread and granary or brown bread. You could do it in terms of the taste for foreign food or particular kinds of foreign food. And you'd also then have to factor in the kind of recent fashion for local, simple, artisanal food as a sort of reaction to that longer history. So taste is corporeal, it's about our bodies, but it's also clearly social and cultural, where eating is a social practice. And I'd argue that that's the sort of thing that's often lost in discussions of food as diet or food as nutrition, the pleasures, the sociality around food and culinary culture. So I'm really interested in what you think about some of this stuff, and particularly, I think, given the fact that I'm a visitor to Portugal, whether these ideas work in terms of your experience of culinary culture, specifically whether those words translate and have similar or different meanings to the words I've been discussing. But let me just end with a quotation from a colleague of mine, an American historian, food historian called Warren Belasco. Warren Belasco argues that food is uniquely attractive because of its ability to link past and present, individual and society, private households and the world economy, palate and power. Thank you very much.
So when you present the word fresh and the contradictions within it, whether you explored the impacts of freshness in the food chain in terms of climate change and connections with energy and all that, or not? Or it just kind of unpacked the words and the contradictions without really thinking about implications? So how far did you go? What would be the 61st word?
Okay, thank you. The book is set up as a series of essays. They're supposed to be provocations or interventions. So like the choice of words isn't comprehensive, nor is each essay. Some of the essays are very short, some of them are much longer. So specifically for freshness, we didn't. It's one of the shorter definitions, partly because Suzanne Friedberg had just written her history of a perishable history of freshness, so there didn't seem much point going into more detail about it. But even in what we've done in a couple of pages on freshness, tries to open up exactly those kind of discussions. So freshness is paradoxical because freshness can be industrially produced, almost the opposite of freshness in everyday language, where it's reduced to equated with ideas of being natural. Prepare food, save food, reheat food, all of those things have huge implications in terms of food waste and energy, climate change and the other things. So these are mostly quite short essays, and there's a limit to how far you can go, but the idea of the book is to try to open up that kind of space in which it becomes obvious that freshness is a marketing ploy, that freshness is industrially produced, that the consumer preference for freshness has all kinds of implications along the supply chain and implications way outside food itself towards environment, sustainability, energy and so on. You've just described our book as crazy, which is good. The process of selection described as crazy. Warren Belasco wrote a little foreword to our book, and he said that the book was bold, some might say brash, and I think the same point is being made. How can you possibly produce a book on food words, which with 61 words, it's automatically a kind of specific cut through the field. It's our keywords from a UK perspective, from a social science perspective, from the affluent place, all of that goes without saying. Sorry, it doesn't go without saying. It's specifically what we talk about in the introduction to the book, and we kind of invite people to say you got it wrong. You know, there's no essay on food, for example. There is no essay on identity. There are specific essays about class and about gender and about race and ethnicity, but not an essay about identity. My wife, who's a vegetarian, picked the book up and said, "Why did you stop at W?" I think work was the last essay. No discussion of vegetarianism. And all kinds of words. There's no essay on organic. There's an essay on natural and an essay on science and technology studies. So everyone will be cross with the book. But that's fine. I don't want people to say, that's the last word, it's done, rest. I want people to say, that's an interesting way to think about food, and from my point of view, you should have written about this or that. And that's fine. It's an invitation to debate, like I think the essay form as a whole is, not a dictionary or an encyclopedia which pretends that you can exhaust the field. It's a great defence from hostile critics.
Yes.
Consumer of food is being used and not eater.
Yep.
And I know Anne-Marie de Mol, in her Body Multiple book, she tries to break a lance for reintroducing the concept of people as eaters instead of consumers of food. What are your thoughts on that?
The word consumer is a very specific way of thinking about eating and the eating subject, who is eating, who is being eaten, and so on. I agree with her approach on that. Why then have we come to think of ourselves as consumers with a particular way of a particular notion of the market, I think is what's implied by consumer. Frank Trentman, historian in the UK, wrote a book called The Birth of the Modern Consumer, and tries to isolate, the point in time in an industrialised world at which we moved from being a public or a shopper or a customer to being a consumer. And that's the point of the book and the way we approach these words. It suggests that there are particular historical forces at work. And it will be very different to abandon the word. I mean, Anne-Marie Maltzman doesn't use the word consumer. It bans it. It says that's an unhelpful way of... it's not an analytical term.
Yeah.
And that is true for many of the words we talk here. At least we try to distinguish between a useful analytical word and then words which are in general circulation, which sort of pretend to be analytical but aren't. And my favourite of those is convenience. You regularly see people in business and marketing use convenience as an explanation. We buy this particular food because it's convenient. And then if you just scratch the surface, convenient means all sorts of things. It means readily available, it means cheap, it means portable, it means accessible, it means all sorts of things. So, you know, the most convenient food might be an apple. All those things. It's portable, it's cheap, it's all those things. And yet it's not a convenience food in the conventional way of thinking. It's the opposite. Convenience food is opposed to food which is raw ingredients, it's natural, and it's opposed to notions of food being junk food. That's what convenience food gets reduced to. And these are highly moralised and politicised debates, not analytical ones at all. So I'd have to think more about how specifically thinking about eating rather than consumption would shape a debate. But I'm glad to say there are essays on eating and drinking. And they force us to think beyond that particular period when we became defined as consumers. So one of the ways I get around that accusation that this is a very ethnocentric project is to force ourselves to look historically and cross-culturally, but to try and do that not in a way which is just collecting examples from around the world, butterfly collecting, I think Leach once described that as, but is a way in which those different examples transform our way of thinking. So Rick Wilk, American anthropologist, did a fantastic book about Belize in Central America, Caribbean, and talked about how Belizean cuisine as a national cuisine only really developed when there was a big enough community of Belizeans living abroad. It's only when you see your cuisine from somewhere else that it becomes a definable cuisine in which you're invested. Otherwise it's just food. And his approach then to saying that the word cuisine itself, his example of Belize is not just another example. It's a way in which it can help us to redefine the notion of cuisine. The words we have here, that almost no overlap with Raymond Williams' keywords, but consumer is one that he does talk about. And he talks about the way in which consumer has the same root as consummation. And again, the links between food and sex are very rich and interesting to unpack. So consume and consummate have ideas that when you eat it, it's finished, it's gone, it's done, it's wasted, it's not there anymore. And often that, of course, isn't the case for food.
On the contrary.
Yeah, exactly. So Raymond Williams' point is that thinking of the consumer society as a sort of a wasteful, excessive, and all the rest of it. That's not inherent in the notion of eating, consuming as eating, but it's there where consumer and consumer society is positioned as bad and profligate and immoral and all the rest of it. So that's exactly the kind of exercise we're trying to do around these words.
I saw you have also the word of odyssey, and following this thought, how you word this word, I mean, in terms of not only tourism but also heritage, because nowadays we are seeing this huge movement of interest and how food is related with some kind of identity, and how you
the essay in front of me, but I'm sure I can remember it. The essay begins with the little thing from Marx, which says that the commodity appears to be a simple thing, and yet it's anything but simple, and through analysing the commodity, you get the history of capitalism, basically. So commodity is definitely on our list, and is a very rich word to unpack. One of the issues in the book is whether we should think about commodities and commodification as a sort of one-way street, a sort of linear process. And the argument in the book is that it isn't that things can go in and out of the commodity form. So if you know the work of people like Apadurai or Kopitov, they talk about exactly this. Yes, Komarov too, yes, exactly, okay. So something that might start life as home-produced, given freely as a gift, taken to a charity shop, sold on, it can move in and out of the commodity form over time. We'd also like to suggest that there is often an argument within debates about commodification that this is necessarily a bad thing, that commodification leads to a debasement of social life. And again, there's lots of examples within the food literature where it's not given that commodification is good or bad. It's an empirical question. There are some winners and some losers, and we want to trace that kind of geography. So there's a fantastic book by Helen Brembeck called Home to McDonald's. And she argues that in Sweden, Friday night is a time for family time, for sociality, for bonding and so on. And she argues that increasingly Swedish families are doing that at McDonald's rather than at home. Oh my God, you know, Swedish family in crisis, the game is up. She argues no, that in some circumstances, fitting with women's lives in Sweden these days, that you can reproduce a lot of the good social stuff around family. It happens to be at McDonald's rather than around the table. And it's a provocative book, so you might not agree with that. I'm not sure I do. But it's trying to argue that within the commodity, we can use commodities to express all kinds of notions of love, of reciprocity, of obligation, and so on. And then you also raise some points about the kind of way in which commodities now, the way in which we now commodify all sorts of things beyond material goods. So we can commodify, it's like the sizzle and the steak, you know, the idea that you're selling, Starbucks would be a better example. Starbucks is selling coffee, but it's obviously also selling ambience. It's selling a particular middle class lifestyle. It's selling a place to hang out and enjoy leisure time, and so on. So I think that the process of commodification now clearly extends beyond things towards atmosphere, emotion, the intangibles that you mentioned. And I think there's a really interesting, we have an essay on brand as well, or branding as a process in the book. And that is about the whole way in which a brand which might start with a physical thing then gets extended beyond it. And then it becomes part of a whole series of economic and social processes. Colleagues in New Zealand are working on the extension of a brand like Hawke's Bay. Hawke's Bay is famous for its dry white wine, and people in Hawke's Bay are saying, well, can we then take that and extend it to other commodities, other foods, other experiences, where the kind of aura that goes around the quality of wine can then be extended to a kind of, in this case, a kind of tourist and heritage experience. So I think that's absolutely right. I think food is one particular version of this commodification process, but it quickly, like so much else, spills out into a whole history of other things. So my examples, I think, tonight show, yes, it's about food, but it's also about gender, and it's about class, and it's about politics and environment, isn't it? Which is why Lady Strauss is right. Food is good to think with.
Sophia.
Just a provocative thing. Would it be interesting to read your book in 20 years' time?
I hope so.
Because if you were reading perhaps 20 years ago, fresh would mean something else.
Yeah, exactly.
So in 20 years' time it would be...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our book is not ahistorical, but it's definitely something which is of the moment. It's definitely our take on these words from our point in time, from our particular geographical and historical circumstances. So I will be amazed if this project was done in 20 years' time, if the same 61 words were the ones about which we wanted to write. I can't imagine how that would be the case. And similarly, as you say, if you looked 20 years ago, you would have a different set of words.
But actually, you haven't maybe said how you reached this consensus about these 61 words. I'm very curious about it.
Okay, yep. The project we were working on, this European Research Council project, had a group of us. Myself in the UK and a colleague in Sweden, Helen Rembeck, the McDonald's person I've just been talking about. And we had between us a team of about 10 or slightly more researchers working with us. They came from a whole series of different disciplines: sociology, media and communications, geography, and so on. And we had a party, that sounds wrong. We had a series of discussions around which we threw words out. We started with, we could do this in 20 words, a bit like Raymond Williams started with an appendix and it grew into a book. Our project kept growing. Each time we had a meeting, a new word would come up that just had to be in there. And in the end, I tried to curtail that by saying, if you come up with the word, you write the essay. And then people started to be quite less enthusiastic about adding more and more words to this ever-growing project. So it's 61 is an arbitrary number, I think. It was a process of discussion and consensus in the same way that the writing of the project became. So we had group meetings where at each meeting we'd have a draft of the next 3 or 4 essays. We'd discuss them amongst ourselves, we would add references, we'd remind ourselves that this was only true in this part of the world at that time. We used Warren Belasco's colleague who was much more familiar with the North American literature than we were, and it kind of emerged. It was a sort of organic kind of project. We definitely started with a list, but it grew, and almost no time did we ever cross a word off the list. That would have been a good discipline, I think, to do that as well. So that's still not a very coherent answer, I don't think. But
it gives an idea.
Because we have a discussion of that in the introduction, and 1 or 2 people who looked at the book have said, well, you don't need that. Why have you got that in there? That's only of interest to you guys. And I thought, no, it's not. It's not, is it? That's part of the book as how it emerged, rather than that it's somehow just there.
Did you bring a copy?
There is at the moment, I have 1 advanced copy at home, so all I have at the moment is this shameless bit of self-promotion saying it's 20% off. Mark, fantastic discount. It will be out in paperback in a year, so it'll be much cheaper in a year's time.
How do you get interested about food?
Well, it is interesting. It's a very, how do I answer that question? It's impossible.
Because I think every one of us had a particular experience with food while you jump on this kind of topic, what happened, right? But but in social science, I mean, that is, in my case was a field that first started to, I was talking about food, and it was something that it just imposed itself in my case, but because I never thought about it before. But I'm an anthropologist, and that's, I don't know.
No, it was different from that for me. My PhD was about migration from the Caribbean to New York City. There was no discussion of food in there. The first book I did, a book called Maps of Meaning, in the late 1980s, was trying to bridge the gap between geography and cultural studies. It could easily have had a chapter about food, but it didn't. It had chapters about all sorts of other things. So food wasn't, it was on my radar, but it wasn't something I certainly didn't describe myself as an expert in it. I still think I don't, actually. But it was through looking at consumption studies, and the cultural politics of consumption that food starts to become inescapable, I think. So I did a project about transnational food and fashion, which tried to grapple with this idea about food's boundaries, and that there were, searching for firm boundaries around food was foolish, and it was all about borrowing and about movement. So that's where I think that's sort of faithful to the geographical, anthropological kind of training I've had. But it's quite an academic way into food. It's not that I'm a foodie. It's not that I have particular food politics. Food, I described in the book you referred to at the beginning, Changing Families, Changing Food. that food was a lens. So I'm that kind of food studies person. I'm not the kind of food studies person who's particularly fascinated by a particular place's culinary culture or by a particular ethics around food. I have those issues, but they're not what drives me.